Thank you. The meeting will please come to order. This is a regular meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Village of Wilmette. I now ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Trustee Sullivan.
Here.
Trustee Barrow.
Here.
Trustee Dodd.
Here.
Trustee Kurzman.
Here.
Trustee Kennedy.
Here.
Trustee Plunkett.
Here.
And President Walensky.
Here. Actually, Mr. Hallgren, I was having problems hearing you at the end there. So if you have to call the roll again, you may want to check that. But we do have a quorum. That's all 7 of us. This meeting is being conducted remotely via the Microsoft Teams software. And I'll now ask Peter Skiles, our Director of Administrative Services, to explain some logistics to those who are dialed into the meeting tonight.
Thank you, President Blinsky. Okay, so everybody here either has joined the meeting or is about to be muted shortly. And when President Blinsky calls for public comment, you can toggle your mute status by clicking on the microphone icon. If you joined us from Microsoft Teams, it's up on the meeting toolbar near the leave button. And if you joined us by audio conference dial-in, you can toggle your mute status by pressing *6 on your phone. And that both turns your mute on and off, and it'll announce what you've done when you press the buttons. Only attendees can unmute themselves. No one can unmute another attendee. So when it's your turn or you've been called to speak, you've got to unmute yourself. And in case of technical difficulty, I just muted everybody, so I'm not quite sure what that was, but we'll get to that in a minute. And if anybody's having technical difficulties providing your public comment, you can jump over to the YouTube live stream that President Blinsky is going to talk about in a few moments here. Put your comment over there, and then I'll read it back into the meeting here for the record. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Skiles. For those watching this video in the future, the state of Illinois is currently under a gubernatorial disaster proclamation, which was issued by Governor Pritzker in response to the coronavirus pandemic. As a result, all in-person village governmental meetings have been canceled. However, the state amended the Open Meeting Act to permit electronic meetings of governmental bodies like the village board during a gubernatorial disaster proclamation. So we are conducting our business tonight in compliance with provisions of state law. Now, as usual, this meeting is being broadcast live on our local cable access channel 6 and on the internet on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/user/villageofwilmette/live. Excuse me. I'll read the URL one more time for people. www.youtube.com/user/villageofwilmette/live, and there's no spaces or dashes or anything in there. A recording of this meeting will be archived on the village's YouTube website, as we do with all of our televised public meetings. Now, as Mr. Skiles alluded to, a remote meeting obviously requires a different mechanic for public participation. So to ensure that our residents, business owners, and other interested parties have the ability to participate in this meeting, we have solicited public comment prior to the start of the meeting via email. If you send an email to publiccomment@wilmette.com prior to the start of the meeting, your email has been provided to board members, and it will be included in the minutes of the meeting, but it will not be read during the meeting. Members of the public who are watching the broadcast can participate during our designated public comment periods by submitting comments through the YouTube live chat feature. And as Mr. Skiles said, he will read your comments to the village board in the meeting. For those of you who have connected to the meeting via the Microsoft Teams software or via the phone, at the appropriate time, I'll ask people to speak up if they'd like to make a public comment. And because of the logistical difficulties of not being in person, I will first ask people to identify themselves as someone who would like to address the board, and then I will assemble a list and then go back to each person individually for their turn to speak. For people speaking during the meeting, they will be allotted 3 minutes to address the board, just as they would be during an in-person meeting. All comments from the public, regardless of how they are received, will be recorded in the meeting minutes. And I'm going to mute everyone. Where is that? Oh, I can't find it. Well, Mr. Skiles, I've lost the mute all button.
I think if
there it is. I got it.
Yeah,
I got it. It disappeared. I mean, they keep changing the software a little bit here. So, so everybody is muted. Please keep yourself muted until you're ready to speak. That just makes the meeting go better without the background noise. Now, before each meeting, the board receives a packet of agenda materials. These materials are also posted on wilmette.com on the Friday before our meeting so that residents and other interested parties can review the very same materials which board members receive. This week's packet contained 319 pages. So we'll move on to item 2, which is public comment. As I said, at an in-person meeting during public comment, individuals are allotted up to 3 minutes to address the board on an item which is not on the agenda. However, because this meeting is being conducted remotely, we have other procedures. As I said, public comments which were submitted by email in advance of the meeting have been provided to the board, will be part of the meeting record, but will not be read during the meeting. At this time, I will now ask people who are watching on YouTube Live to submit comments for the village staff to read. You can find the chat window to the right of the YouTube Live video window. So if you have a comment, please type that in now. And while those folks are typing, I will ask if there are any individuals who have connected to the meeting via the Teams software or via the telephone who would like to address the board. I'd ask people to please identify themselves now, and I will assemble a list. Again, you have to unmute yourself because I muted everyone. And if you did dial in by the phone, I don't see anybody who's dialed in by the phone, but if you had dialed in by the phone, you also have to hit *6, not just unmute your own phone. Okay, well, I don't hear anyone that has requested to address the board, so I will ask Mr. Skiles if there were any comments submitted via YouTube Live chat.
Yes, President Polinsky, one comment from Bear Sternad, and it's a question. How is Wilmette currently dealing with Lake Michigan's erosion issue? Specifically, how is Wilmette's infrastructure protected from Lake Michigan's erosion? Thank you, Bear Sternad.
Okay, that seems like a comment that should be followed up by staff. We did, just for that resident's edification, we actually had quite a lengthy presentation by the Army Corps of Engineers at one of our December meetings. But if you, Mr. Brayman, should the individual email you so you can connect him with the staff here?
Yes, that would be great. And my email is my last name and first initial, so BraymanM@wilmette.com. And Peter can type that back in the chat box.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And the staff will follow up with that resident on that question. Mr. Skiles, any other chat questions?
No other questions or comments, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will move on to item 3, which is the consent agenda. As described on the agenda, items which are routine business that are not normally debated by the board are placed on the consent agenda. All items that begin with the number 3 are on the consent agenda, and tonight that consists of items 3.1 through 3.26. Items on the consent agenda are up for approval tonight if an item is not removed by a member of the audience and is not removed by one of the trustees, the item will be approved and will not be discussed. So I'll begin by asking if there's any member of the audience who would like to remove an item from the consent agenda. If you are watching on YouTube Live, you may submit that request via the chat window again. And then if there are any individuals who are connected to the meeting via the Teams software or the telephone, if you'd like to remove an item from the consent agenda, I'd ask you to please identify yourself now. And again, you have to unmute yourself because I muted you. And if you're dialing in on a phone, you'll also have to hit *6 in addition to unmuting your phone. Would anyone like to remove anything from the consent agenda? Okay, everybody's still muted. Mr. Skiles, were there any individuals via YouTube Live that requested an item removed from the consent agenda?
No requests, Mr. President.
Okay. So then I'll move on. Are there any items that any of the trustees would like to remove from the consent agenda? You guys are all muted, so all right, very good. You guys know how to unmute yourself, so I will proceed here with asking for a motion to adopt the consent agenda.
So moved.
That was Trustee Sullivan. Is there a second?
Second.
That was Trustee Dodd, I believe. Is that
Kennedy.
Trustee Kennedy? Trustee Kennedy, okay. So it's been moved and seconded. Would the clerk please call the roll on the motion to adopt the consent agenda?
Trustee Sullivan.
Aye.
Trustee Barrow.
Aye.
Trustee Dodd.
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman.
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy.
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett.
Aye.
And President Belinsky.
Aye, so the motion carries. The consent agenda has been adopted. If you were here for an item on the consent agenda, it was just approved. And I'll clarify for those who are watching or who dialed in, again, all the items beginning with 3 have been approved, and that includes tonight Land Use Committee items 3.6 and 3.7. And then also I will highlight that item 3.19 on the Municipal Services Committee was just approved. And that is a resolution adopting or approving the Village of Wilmette Master Bike and Active Transportation Plan, which we talked about at length at our last meeting. So if you were here for one of those items, it was just approved. There'll be no further discussion of those items or any of the other items on the consent agenda. So you are free to log off or hang out. Of course, more than welcome to watch the rest of the meeting. So we'll move on to item 4, which is report of officers. The first item on under report of officers is item 4.1. Recognition of the Complete Count Committee relating to the 2020 census. And I believe I am turning that over to Mr. Adler or Ms. Roberts or Mr. Brayman, one of the 3 of
Lisa
you.
Roberts is going to take the lead.
Okay, Ms. Roberts, welcome.
Thank you, President Blinsky. It's my pleasure.
Lisa,
You need
Lisa,
to-
can you
You
speak
need to
up a
speak
little
up,
bit?
though. Either closer to the mic or louder.
Sorry. It's my pleasure to report to the board and to the residents of Wilmette that Wilmette completed the 2020 census with an 86% self-response rate. This was a significant increase over the 2010 self-response rate of 82.8%. Our response rate was second only to Gulf among our area neighbors, third among communities of 25,000 or greater, and 24th highest in the state out of almost 1,300 municipalities. We were able to achieve this improved response rate because of our Complete Count Committee. The Complete Count Committee is a structure that the Census Bureau encourages communities and community groups to use to direct local outreach to those hardest to count in the census. I'd like to recognize the individual committee members, some of whom are with us tonight. Cindy Levine, Liz Seeger, George Pierce, Julie Usum, Nancy Wagner, and Jim Bowman. They provided direction on how to best reach out to the community, and they provided the man and woman power to distribute posters and yard signs, give presentations to community groups, and staff 2 public events. I'd particularly like to recognize Cindy as co-president of the League of Women Voters Wilmette. The National League was a partner in the census, and Cindy contacted me to see what Wilmette was doing locally. After 2 meetings in October of 2019 to brainstorm participation, we realized that there was a need to ramp up outreach this year, and there was enough interest to create a committee to help get the word out. Without Cindy's input, we would most likely have done kind of a minimal amount of promotion. The village was fortunate to receive a small grant from the state of Illinois through the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. This grant of $3,500 covered all but about $60 of our out-of-pocket expenses. The pandemic curtailed our outreach efforts, but hopefully you saw at least 1 yard sign or the banner at Village Hall or a poster at a local business or other building. I'd also like to thank Caitlin Cernak from Metro Strategies, the company that handles our village's electronic communications. Caitlin made census promotions a priority and ran with them without my having to ask her when to put things out. I'd also like to thank Village Manager Mike Brayman and Assistant Manager Eric Hallgren for their support. And finally, I'd like to thank the residents who completed their census response and those who posted our yard signs and spread the word to their neighbors. For all of our hard work, we got this great printable certificate. So thank you and congratulations to Wilmette.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts, and thank you to all who served on the committee. I do see a number of them signed into the meeting, so thank you for your efforts there. As we've told people, the census is important. Not only does it determine our representation in various legislative bodies, but it also determines the state and federal dollars that flow back to Wilmette. So it's important that people are all counted, and we appreciate the efforts in this regard, and it's something we can be proud of. So thank you. Mr. Brayman, anything to add to that?
No, I would like to thank Lisa. I think she did a great job acknowledging the residents who assisted, but she was really a core force in driving this and getting this done. And it truly is an impressive accomplishment for our community to have that high of a response rate. So thank you to Lisa and thank you to the members of the committee.
Yes, and I will also thank Ms. Roberts for her efforts there, leading it from a staff point of view. Very good. We'll move on to item 4.2, which is introduction of Alan George, who is recommended for appointment to the Plan Commission. Mr. George, I think I saw that you were online. If you would unmute yourself, and there you are. I can see you now. Take a minute or so to introduce yourself to the board. You've got quite an impressive resume. That's an amazing fit for the Plan Commission. So would you share that with the board members and the community?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I guess President Belinsky, I was going to say Bob, but I guess that's not appropriate in this particular meeting. We moved to Wilmette in 1992 and have lived here since then. Although my original experience with Wilmette was sailing out of Sheridan Shores and the Wilmette Harbor, which I began doing that in 1984. So I've had a long history with Wilmette. We've raised 4 children here, the last of whom is graduating from high school this year in a very challenging time, as we all know. We've really enjoyed living in Wilmette and seeing it evolve over time. We lived very close to downtown, as we still do, when we first moved here. And I recall walking downtown Wilmette Friday and Saturday nights, and there was literally no one. The place was dark, and you could shoot a cannonball down the street. And moving to the point where the last few years prior to the COVID, certainly, that you couldn't get a parking space. And I think that's been a terrific evolution. So watching the village evolve over time has really been has been terrific, and really like where Wilmette has gone so far. I know several of the neighboring towns sort of reference Wilmette as what they want to be when they grow up. So I think that's a pretty positive thing. I previously served on the Wilmette Housing Commission, and I currently serve on the Lakeshore Apartment Board. I also serve on the board of the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, Massachusetts, part of Amherst College, and shortly be joining a private fund board. I am also retiring at the end of this month from Equity Residential Property Trust, which is an S&P 500 company, which I joined shortly before it went public, and helped grow from $750 million to a $35 billion company. I served as Chief Investment Officer for the last 20 years, and various other acquisition and asset management jobs prior to that for the company. In all, I have about 35 years of commercial real estate experience, primarily multifamily, although in retail and hotels and some other sort of sundry things. And in my time at the company, I ran asset management development, the transactions group, environmental, market research, capital projects, and some other teams. I'm really interested in joining the Planning Commission because for several reasons. First of all, I spent a lot of my career doing exactly this on the private side, which is assisting as part of a team with strategic planning and implementation. And I really enjoy it. And secondly, I've been very interested. I'm very interested in seeing kind of the evolution of this master plan, working with the citizens of Wilmette, seeing how that all evolves, and helping being part of the team that kind of maps that out going forward. So it all sounds like a really great opportunity. I'd happy to take any questions or comments, or none at all, if that's appropriate. Thank you.
Well, and as you alluded to, you recently, or you were about to retire, and we're looking for some way to stay sort of engaged, right?
Absolutely, and I can't think of a better way to do it. So it sounds like a great opportunity.
Any questions from any of the trustees for Mr. George? Well, look, we all appreciate when Wilmette residents share their talents with the community, and as I said in my earlier comments, I mean, your background is pretty much perfect for what the Plan Commission has, and I know your experience and expertise and knowledge will be additive to their work. So thank you for volunteering. And as I think at the next meeting, you were recommended at this meeting. The next meeting, the village board will vote on that, and if assuming that the board does vote in favor of that, you will be a member of the Plan Commission. So welcome and thank you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the time.
Okay, we'll move on to the report from our village manager, Mr. Brayman.
Thank you, President Belinsky. Once again, my report will center around the county's COVID-19 vaccination efforts, and I have 2 points on that. The first is that you may have seen reports in the media that there's going to be a local vaccination clinic opening at New Trier West shortly. Our team, along with our partners in Winnetka, have been a driving force behind that effort. It's going to be closed to the public, but focused on teachers and first responders, such as police officers, firefighters, and utility plant operators. That is set to open tomorrow and to administer 500 shots on its first day. And there'll be additional information forthcoming tomorrow with a press release and a press conference at that site. And we're really excited to be a part of that and really serve as a model for the rest of Cook County and the state on how local resources and paramedics can be used to help accelerate this rollout. Secondly, we have partnered with the Women's Club of Wilmette to help our senior citizens, our vulnerable residents, and those who are not necessarily tech savvy attain COVID-19 vaccination appointments. And we have a list of residents that the club is reaching out to identify who is in need of assistance. And through our community caretakers program, we're identifying volunteers who can then connect with those residents, help them register, and even take them to the appointment if that's necessary. We've already had some early success and received some great feedback from our residents who've already received assistance. So we'll keep these efforts up. We'll keep pushing to help the county accelerate the rollout, and we'll continue to update our website and use our e-news and social media to keep our residents informed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brayman. Next report is from our Corporation Counsel, Mr. Stein.
I have no report, Mr. President.
Next item on the agenda is item 5. That is the report of the Liquor Control Commissioner. There's no report tonight. So we will move on to our standing committee reports. And first up, as always, is the Land Use Committee, and that is Trustee Barrow as chair.
All items are on the consent agenda.
Next up is the Finance Committee report, and that is Trustee Kennedy.
The only item on the agenda, other than what is on the consent agenda, is the fiscal year 2020 financial update, and I will turn the floor over to Mr. Hallgren, I believe, or Mr. Brayman, one of them.
We're going to start with Mr. Brayman, and we're going to, Ms. Malloy, myself, and Mr. Brayman will be tackling this together.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, thank you, Trustee Kennedy. And Eric's going to pull that presentation up for us. And while he does, I just have a few introductory remarks before Eric and Melinda will then roll through the presentation. Overall, and Eric, if you could go to the, I think it's the third slide. There we go. Overall, we really have great news to report to the board and to the community. We ended the year in a very strong position, much stronger than we had anticipated, and we'll get into that into some detail. But the good news is our reserve has grown. It's greater than we had anticipated to be, and we are working proactively with the Finance Committee now, who has held one meeting, is going to hold additional discussions and reviewing our budget reserve policy, as well as reviewing staff recommendations in terms of how to potentially spend down that reserve if we deem it to be higher than it needs to be, and bring that back to the board sooner and earlier on in our budget process for 2022, so we have a solid plan moving into next budget year and feel comfortable with where our reserve level is going to be and how we can spend that down.
Yeah, and Mike, let me just interrupt you for a second here. I mean, look, in neighboring communities at the state level, at the federal level, everybody is talking about how big a hole that COVID has dug for the budgets, and the village staff really deserves a lot of credit here for aggressively managing the budget, reporting monthly to the board on progress. We set a goalpost. We evaluated where we were vis-a-vis those plans. And look, I'm not sure residents noticed us cutting costs. It's not like we were cutting services at the same time. We were deferring some maintenance and deferring some capital maybe. But look, for no impact on the community, to come to the board and report that for 2020, we actually did better than expected overall, I think is a pretty outstanding and amazing job that the staff executed here. So before we get too much further, I just wanted to add that comment to the beginning of the presentation here.
Thank you, President Belinsky. We appreciate that, and we appreciate the board's support, especially early on in the pandemic when there was a lot of uncertainty. And we made a lot of difficult decisions at the time. And as you can see on this slide here, we underspent compared to budget by $2 million. And that has helped position us to be well positioned moving forward into 2022 and beyond. And we're not out of the pandemic yet. So I think we need to be cautious on that. And we're going to continue to see peaks and valleys as we progress. But really, the last 4 months of the 2020 fiscal year were outstanding, and they exceeded our expectations. So when we talk about our projected year-end reserves, we put those together in August of each year. Well, there's 4 months left in the year, and these last 4 months really performed better than any of us ever could imagine. And Melinda will talk about it more, but real estate transfer tax more than doubled our average take from September to December in 2020. Permits, in December, we had $225,000 in non-recurring revenue. So there was a lot of good news to happen at the end of the year, and we feel really good about where we're at as we move forward. Now, what that means is that we do have flexibility this year and next year. Our reserve level, we had anticipated it to be about 11.2 million. It's now going to start the year at 12.6 million. And that'll be a factor in the Finance Committee's conversations and in staff's policy recommendations on how we look to invest in infrastructure or pensions or both as we move throughout the course of this year and into next year. And there's a slide here on the general fund where we talk about the year-end reserve, and we'll talk about some early ideas we have, but we're going to drill down into this in much greater detail at the Finance Committee. So Eric, if you can go on to the next slide.
So as Mike was just alluding to, there's a couple things I'd like you to take away from the slide. The first thing is look at the timing. So look at what happened in May and June. So at that point in time, the pandemic is in full effect. We're starting to get some sense as to what could be happening to some of our revenues compared to budget projections. And then as Mike was telling you before, when you look at the end of the year, all of a sudden you start to see some of the overperformance happening, especially if you look at October and December. And as Mike was mentioning, in particular, in December, we saw two very large non-recurring permits happen in that month. So overall, revenues underperformed the budget by just shy of 2%. But really, the last 3 months of the year were fairly robust, and we actually we should be thankful that things turned out much better than what we had anticipated earlier in the year when we were putting the budget together. So as Eric goes to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about some of these revenue sources in particular. So Mike has already mentioned real estate transfer tax. Again, that performed over 400,000 better than what we anticipated. And I'm sure people have seen articles in the newspaper that have talked about what has been happening in the real estate market. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We've already talked to you about what happened with permit activity. Just so you know, regular permit activity actually underperformed the budget. It was the non-recurring activity that is really what allowed this revenue source in total to outperform what our expectations were. But there's two other ones that I really want to hone in on. One is income tax. But when you look at this chart, it's not that income tax performed in a way like the real estate transfer or permit activity. But what's important to note about this is when we put the budget together, we had thought that income tax was going to underperform to the tune of almost 200,000 compared to what we budgeted. And if you think about it, that would make sense because the pandemic is occurring. We're hearing about unemployment and the growth that's happening in that. And the market is declining, the stock market at that time. So income tax, as the year went on, it was being forecast to really underperform budget expectations. What happened is forecasters didn't anticipate how large and how influential stimulus payments would be and what that was really going to mean. So the fact that we actually hit, for all intents and purposes, our budget expectation is an amazing thing that happened with income tax. But that's one that, as Mike said before, we're not out of this situation, and it's one that we need to watch going forward. The other item I'd like you to take a look at is sales tax. That's one that we've all talked about a lot. We've provided support to our local businesses. When you break down sales tax, what I'd like you to understand is that the brick and mortar and the home rule sales tax underperformed budget. Why this revenue source, though, looks the way that it does is that the local use tax actually brought in $1.1 million. Two reasons for that. One is you might recall that we've talked about the Level the Playing Field Act. So that is something that the state passed. It actually was impacting two of our revenue years. In 2020, what it meant is how local use tax, in terms of internet transactions, how that tax was going to be collected was shifting from the individual who needed to report it on their income tax returns versus making the business report it and collect it and distribute it back to the state. So already we had anticipated that local use tax was going to increase, but didn't have data to tell us how much that was going to increase. And then the pandemic impacted people's behavior as well. So again, it's not startling to think that there was a lot more transactions that happened internet-wise. So local use tax is another item that way outperformed our budget expectations.
And Ms. Malloy, would you remind us, there's a shift, the next shift in state law is that the internet purchases actually attributable to Wilmette will be getting that tax, right? That hasn't started yet, or it has started? When does that start?
It has. So thank you so as I was mentioning, there was the two components. One that happened, the first piece happened in 2020, which was just to try to get businesses to collect this sales tax. What President Belinsky is talking about is the second piece that went into effect January 1 of this year. And what that means is no longer are internet transactions going to be subject to the local use tax, which is taxed at a different rate. The level the playing field is to make that tax be the same as brick and mortar. So the 6 1/4 tax and our home rule sales tax is now going to apply to where the internet purchase is actually delivered. So the expectation is that although local use tax collections are going to decline significantly, we're going to see the regular sales tax and the home rule sales tax increase because those will be collected on the internet purchases at the point of destination.
So all those Amazon trucks that we see, that's a good thing for our sales tax number now, where before it was irrelevant, or less. Before it was irrelevant and then less relevant. Now it's very relevant.
I would say yes. It was relevant before, but it's going to make a huge difference to us, we believe, in 2021. So as Eric goes to the next slide, this one I'm going to call the thank goodness 2020 revenues were not as bad as what we had projected earlier. That's really what this slide is going to tell you. So we know that as the pandemic started, we built a model, and it was to try to help us think about what might happen to our revenues as we looked at the different sources and various assumptions, and consulted different sources that we could to give us some idea as to what might happen. So you obviously see that in June and July, starting really in May, we saw a decline happening in terms of what we were projecting could happen. And it was really, as we kept updating this every month with the actuals, you see that by the time we get to December, we are almost at where we thought we might have been when we put the budget together. So what really drove this? Again, it's $400,000 in additional real estate transfer tax collections than what we expected. What that really amounted to was 130 more transactions than we had in the year prior. 170,000 more in permit activity that was really driven by non-recurring permit activity, and about 200,000 in local use tax, greater than what we received in 2019. That is what really drove these revenue numbers to perform at the level that they did. So as Eric goes to the next slide, he's going to talk to us about expense results.
Right. So going off of the prior slide that Melinda showed, where we saw those significant revenue dips that we were expecting in May and June, the village took immediate action in trying to defer some of our costs. That included deferrals of some of our capital equipment costs, deferring of the comp plan, as well as deferrals of personnel hiring and some other expenditures within our operations for things like training, forestry, street lighting, that really helped to drive down the expense side with the expectation at that point in time that we were going to see significant revenue losses. So we really tried to take a proactive measure to offset those potential revenue losses, which we now see total savings of around $2 million in expenses comparatively to budget. So as we walk through kind of some of these major areas, personnel expenses are down because we held several positions open in public safety as well as in public works. Contractual services included savings that were included winter operations as well as savings in forestry and street lighting. Other expenses, this was really two major items. One of them was savings associated with our fleet operations, and the other one was associated with our hotel rebate, where we paid a component based upon a percentage of our receipts. Because our hotel revenues went down significantly, the associated expense associated with that rebate went down as well. On the capital outlay side, there were several items, including the deferral of several vehicles, as well as AV equipment in the council chambers that were deferred. And then on the contingency side, there was some additional savings based upon economic grants that were not granted as part of the original approval. So all in all, across these major categories, we saw savings of approximately $2 million. And then here you'll see on the expense outcome side how we performed our actuals comparatively to budget. So in the month of June and July, as a reaction to those downturns in revenues in the prior months, we really tried to scale back spending in those spaces to save dollars. And then you can kind of see how the spending changed throughout the remainder of the year. So combining the revenue and the expense side, we come to the reserve projections, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mike to talk through this slide.
All right, thank you, Eric. And we hit on this a little bit at the beginning, but there's kind of 2 points I want to make on this slide. The first is, I think what's really most impressive in the way the board and the staff handled the unknown and the uncertainty at the beginning of the pandemic was that we didn't panic. We were thoughtful in our approach. We methodically reviewed our expenses, our revenues. We did not make major cuts to services or personnel that would impact services. And this is one of the reasons why. We've got a really strong reserve position. And that same mentality was how we approached the 2021 budget. As you may recall, we had made the decision not to make major service level or expense reductions because when we were working on the budget in August, we didn't know what February, March, April, May, and June were going to look like. And we made the right decision, right? We saw what happened for the rest of 2020, and we're well positioned. And what that tells us is we're likely going to see an increase in that reserve level even in 21 because we conservatively or responsibly assumed that revenues would continue to underperform significantly. So we're not out of the woods yet, as I mentioned, but we are well positioned for this fiscal year. So what we'll be doing and working with the Finance Committee is tightening up that reserve policy, identifying where we want that to really sit, how we should spend it down, how quickly, and then get into discussions on what to spend it down on. We've had preliminary internal discussions, and we're going to be providing feedback to the committee and to the board. But initial ideas, are obviously infrastructure. We're in the middle of a major downtown reconstruction project that we were intending to issue debt for. We could make the decision, instead of issuing debt, use our reserves and then reallocate the debt service, which would be about $250,000 a year, to an accelerated road program and start getting more roads done sooner than 2026, which was our target to increase funding. Another idea, and we're working with our actuary, is to see if we put more money into our pensions sooner, how does that help our amortization transition? How does that potentially reduce our tax levy impacts associated with that transition in the next few years? So there's a lot of different ideas and scenarios that we'll work through that really can make a difference from an infrastructure standpoint, from a pension funding standpoint, and from a taxpayer standpoint. So we're excited to work with the committee on that, and more to come as we work through the year.
Mr. Brayman, this is Trustee Kennedy. I have one question. Some of that $2 million savings is really just a deferral. It's not a permanent savings. Can you quantify for us approximately how much of that $2 million is just a deferral and how much of that is a permanent savings?
Eric, can you go back to that expense slide? Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so if we were looking at the components of deferral, so if we were looking at our capital equipment as well as our comp plan, we were probably looking at around $500,000 in expenditures that were deferrals. So items like the comp plan, as well as like the sidewalk snowplow machine, the AV equipment in the council chambers, those were all reprogrammed as part of the 2021 budget. So those are expected to be expenditures as part of this year. There were some pure savings that were included in there, but those deferrals equated to roughly $500,000.
Thank you.
And Trustee Kenny, to your point, when we defer in one year, what that means is future years are getting deferred as well. So as we work on the next 10-year CIP, we'll take our financial position into account and look at what we may have pushed back and see if there's a need to pull that back earlier, or if we can keep it to where it was deferred based on last year.
Well, I take it that anything deferred doesn't have to affect the current year's spending. It's just that we choose to do it that way, right?
Correct.
So-
And if let's say we deferred in our capital planning a fire engine based on the expense of the apparatus and where we were during the year. If that piece of apparatus is not performing well, is costing us in repairs, we may now pull it back up sooner. And those are the discussions we'll have at a committee of the whole meeting.
Thank you.
One question for me. The sales tax is on a lag, and I know we were concerned last winter, in particular with the shutdown on indoor dining. Do we have any data from October, November, December yet in terms of what our receipts were for those months?
So we have information in the monthly report that I think takes us through October. So the November information, we should be getting that actually shortly.
Okay. Yeah, I think we were really concerned about November. Like when did indoor dining end? Was it somewhere around mid-October? My recollection right?
I think that's about right.
Yeah. Okay.
And President Belinsky, we know through our grant program that once the weather turned, the restaurants took a very big hit. So that will be coming through in the next few months, and we'll see that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So again, good news here, but we haven't felt the impact of COVID at the back half of the year yet in terms of the sales tax because of the lag. So
Correct.
And hey, Mike, it's Trustee Sullivan. When you were giving your opening comments, you said we were projecting our year-end reserve to be 12.6 million. Can you just explain the difference of what the residents are looking at versus what you made that comment?
Eric, do you want to take that?
I think the 12.6 was looking at what our new 2021 year end will be. So currently, our original budgetary projections were around $11.1 million at the end of 2021 as part of that budget. Because we had an increase of roughly $1.5 million in our reserves based upon 2020 activity, we now expect 2021's year-end reserve to be at a $12.6 million mark.
Different year.
It's just kind of stepping it out another year.
Yeah, different year. So thank you, Trustee Sullivan. That was good point of clarification.
Yeah, I was not very clear, so thank you. And I think that's really the benefit of this dynamic model we have in these regular updates, is we'll keep updating that 2021 year-end number as we move forward, and we'll have a much better handle on where we think our reserve is going to be than in past years where we may have only looked at it, 2, maybe even 3 times a year. So this will be really informative to the board as we start making decisions.
And just one clarification: how do we calculate that percent of operating expense? What number are we using?
So we are calculating that ending reserve value off of the budgeted expense. So it's the 14.96 over the 35.56.
Yep, that's what I got.
Right.
Melinda, I have a question on, you were talking about our local use tax bringing in from all of our online sales. How far, the reporting on that, how far behind are we? When will we you said it's going to look great in 2021. I'm just kind of curious, is that farther behind than our sales tax numbers in terms of understanding where we are on those sales?
So when we will find out, President Belinsky was already alluding to it, but just to sort of give you some sense. So as I was telling you, the new law goes into effect starting January 1. So if we say January is the liability month, that gets reported to the state in February. We don't see the distribution until April, and then it usually takes us like another month to get the actual details from the state so that we could start charting it out.
So really, the first time we're going to be reporting that to the board is probably May, right, Melinda and Eric?
We're going to have a lump sum number in April, but to really actually look at what makes it up, all the components to it. So we'll have the lump number, but to look at the details, it takes another month before we get that information.
And is that lump number the sales from January then, or what is that number?
So,
okay, so
those deliveries and bills that were paid in the month of January, companies don't report. So they collect it in January, they submit it to the state in February, and then the state takes time to, do everything that they need to do with the numbers. They don't distribute it to the municipalities until April.
After April, will we have that information on a monthly basis, or is that going to be lumped again?
It's the same. I'm going to answer your question this way. Sort of that timing is the same every month. So in May, we will see February's information in terms of the lump dollar amount, and then it will take at least another month before I see the details that make up the February number.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Ms. Moy, if I understand correctly, there's actually sort of a reclassification also taking place, and I didn't realize this until tonight, that what was the use tax is now going to be part of our sales tax number, and so you're going to have to parse it out. It won't be delineated at that point in time.
So you are correct. We're going to see now, so local use tax number is going to decline, and we're going to see an increase in both the regular sales tax number and our home rule sales tax. We do get detail on that, just like we do with categories for the local use tax. So that's what I'm saying. It will take a month even after we get the distribution for us to see the categories that it applies to.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I just have one more question on this slide. Just does this ending reserve, does it include our surf balance as well?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Moving on.
Melinda's going to
This
take
slide says to me it was a dry summer. That's what this slide says to me.
You're correct. And so that is right. We've talked about this before. We've joked about this before. It's been many years since we've said we've had a drought. And so what it means is both, it has the impact on both our sewer fund and our water fund. Really, the sewer fund performed just slightly better than what we anticipated. So we'll talk a little bit about the details. I think that's going to help right away. So Eric, if you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. So let's start with the revenue piece. And with the revenues, it is up 250,000, 15,000. Why? Because consumption was up. The sewer charges follow the consumption of water usage. So when there's a drought and consumption is up, we expect to see our sewer revenue up. But the other piece I think that we want to hone in on is the stormwater charges. So in this pandemic year that we had, not only did we accomplish a major infrastructure project that had to do with stormwater, but we were able to actually implement a whole new utility fee. And there was a lot of components to it, one of which was trying to hone in on the data that made up. So the final property review that we had to do with our outside consultant so that we could bill this new utility fee correctly. If you might remember, there was a timing issue in terms of when single family residents started to get billed, and then when the non-single family residents were billed. We had a lot of discussion about stormwater credits, so we made decisions on those. We've started to implement those. So in the end, stormwater charges underperformed our budget expectation by about 184,000. Of that, about 30,000 is due to timing. And what I mean by that is in December, it's just a timing issue. There's 3 utility bills that go out the door. The last one is really almost, it's like, on January or December 29th. So there is a timing of when we will get those collections. We had anticipated that this revenue source, after we had honed in on the data, was going to underperform by roughly 155,000. So it kind of has come in as we expected.
Right, and we set this budget well before we had finalized our stormwater charges, before we had finalized what the fees were going to be. This budget was set in the fall, and we didn't finalize those until, the final, what, May or June?
Yes.
So, yeah. The other comment, I guess, you said, residential sewer charges slightly overperformed, but I honestly can't remember, in the last 6 or 8 years, it ever overperforming at all. Like we've always seemed to have had wet weather and this charge, underperformed budget. So overperforming by a little seems like, very better news than it sounds like. How about that? Is that a fair statement?
It is. I think 2012 was the last time that we had a drought situation and you saw a result somewhat similar to this. It's been that long.
Yeah.
And
okay.
President Belinsky, you're right, and we'll see our reserve slide in a few. But I remember it was over 10 years ago. The sewer fund was actually in the red. It was negative, and we had to transfer money from the water fund to keep it afloat. So yes, the sewer fund has struggled over time, and this was a really good year.
Hey, Melinda, a quick question here.
Yes.
Oh, good. I am not.
You're on. I can see you, Peter.
Good. I know that we benchmarked or earmarked the stormwater fee in light of our debt service.
Mm-hmm.
And could you address whether this difference in actual to budget has any impact upon the debt service that we have for the stormwater project?
I'm glad that you raised that issue, because collections right now are tracking what we would need in order to service the debt. And that's part of why we put the reminder on this slide of the rate increase that's going to happen in 2021. And I think we've also talked several times that as we get a better sense, so now we're getting close to understanding what a year's worth of collection of this revenue source is. We'll have a better sense as to what we think rate increases could be in the future, especially after we go through our second bond issuance that we anticipate doing this spring.
I think Trustee Barrow was also alluding to the fact that it's likely that our actual debt service, given the success of our bond issue, is probably lower than what we budgeted for debt service.
Yeah, that too.
You are correct.
And that's all good news.
And
actually, the 2020 budget has a lot of really good news in it.
Yeah.
During a pandemic.
Yes.
And we'll be completing our next bond issuance this summer, and we'll be 2/3 of the way done with the neighborhood storage project. So we'll have a much better feel for where that rate is going to end up. And the Finance Committee is also looking at the reserve related to the stormwater utility fee, because we don't necessarily think it needs to be as high as it does for the sewer fee, because it does not swing based on consumption. It's a stable revenue source, which is why we selected it. So that is something that the board and the committee will be studying this year as well.
So moving over to this, the operating expenditure side, again, in this space, we did see the deferral of some expenses, including the delay in hiring of a maintenance worker within our public works space, which provided some savings on the personnel side. There was also some deferral of capital equipment, including vehicle purchases. The other important piece to note here within our commodity spaces, we did see savings here. We'll also see it again on the water fund side, where we saw savings associated with our purchase power expenditure. We invested, or we rebid our energy purchases, and we were able to purchase green energy for our utilities, for the stormwater pumping station as well as our water plant, at a lower price than we had previously projected as part of the budget. Also included in here, you'll notice both in the sewer fund and when we get to the water fund in a little bit, there was an increase in our debt service comparatively to budget. This was due to the refundings that we did this year. There is savings over the next 4 years. However, there was a slight increase in our debt service payment for 2020. And then the other expense savings is really associated with our vehicle costs and our maintenance costs and fuel costs associated with our vehicles, just due to a decrease in usage.
And
So again, look.
sorry,
Yes.
this is Trustee Kennedy. Again, some of that is a permanent savings, and some of it, like the capital outlay, is probably just a deferral. Is that correct?
That is correct on the capital outlay side, all of those. And that actually goes really well into the next section on the reserve projections. We did see an increase here in our reserves going up from just over 39% up to 42%. But we do have that expectation on the sewer fund side that we will be drawing down future year fund balances as we continue to invest in capital, including major equipment purchases as well as sewer main repairs. So that's part of the expectation as we move into 2021 and into the future years. So moving over into the water fund, Melinda was going to discuss this slide.
So again, the water fund, not unlike the sewer fund, we saw an increase in what happened with the reserves. It is due to revenues performing slightly better than we expected, and we also had some expense savings. So as Eric goes to the next slide and we look a little closer at what was happening with the water charges, I think we've said enough about the fact that consumption was up. So our residential water charges performed better than we expected, which was fantastic. On the wholesale side, if you remember, we have a new wholesale customer that started with us in June. They have performed as expected. But as I say that to you, they performed as expected in a pandemic situation. So it gives me some pause to think about what that consumption level might be in the future. And I say that because we put that projection together back when we did a contract renewal with Glenview, which I think was back now, might correct me, 4 or 5 years ago. So our estimate of what we thought that new wholesale customers' consumption number was, it's almost right on target, but it's right on target in this pandemic situation. So again, we will continue to monitor that as we go forward. So
Melinda, when you say pandemic situation, I think you mean drought. So there was the drought last year, and they just met our kind of average expectation. So I think we anticipate annual revenues from North Main to be less than we expected. But there's still a lot of data for us to collect. And what that means is that we may have to look at our future water main replacement program and look at additional funding sources or scaling it back or potentially deferring it a little further. But we need some more time to collect a full year's worth of data from North Main.
Yes.
This is Trustee Kennedy. It's also my understanding from things I've read that utility usage, including water usage at homes, has gone up simply because people are home. And instead of at the office. And we probably can't quantify that, but it may be that some of these things will come down a little bit just because people go back to work and aren't flushing their toilet anymore, but or whatever.
No, I think you're absolutely right.
Trustee Kennedy. So if we don't have any other questions on that, I think Eric's going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the expenses.
Yeah, and again, another similar situation here as we saw on the sewer fund side with the deferral of the hiring of positions. Again, some of those deferrals on the capital side for vehicle purchases that were reprogrammed into the 2021 budget. Here, the commodities savings is really attributable all to those green energy purchases and our savings that we can have for powering the water plant. And then looking on the debt service side, again, similarly, we did as part of the refunding, we have increased costs in year one, but we'll have savings over the next 4 years. So both the water fund and the sewer fund perform very similar based upon the drought, and then also on the expenditure side, they had very similar patterns. So again, in this space, as we go through and look, we saw a significant increase in our reserves going from 43% to 48%. This is clearly higher than what was included in the 2021 budget. But again, what this does is it provides us flexibility as we move into the future years when we start to want to potentially look at other capital investment, such as the water main replacement program or other significant capital investment within the water fund.
And it's also provided us flexibility to not raise water rates. So in the several past years, we've projected residential rate increases, and we've been able to avoid those largely due to our strong reserve position.
Yeah, you referenced a couple of times the water main replacement program, something we've been talking about for years, that the decision was made to wait until North Main came online to commence that, and we're there now. So presumably we're going to commence that, and that's, I mean, I believe million plus a year, right, for that?
In an ideal world, yes. I'm not sure we'll be able to hit that number based on our projections, but we'll be scrubbing that and updating it, once we have more North Main data.
And with that, unless there's any other further questions, that concludes the presentation on the 3 major operating funds.
Any questions from any of the trustees for the staff? I know people were jumping in as we talked as well, but. All right. Thank you to Ms. Malloy, Mr. Hallgren, and Mr. Brayman for the presentation. That was very helpful. And again, I do think the staff deserves kudos for helping us manage through last year, which was a tough year for everyone, but in particular, many municipalities, have had to take relatively drastic actions here to compensate for that. So, Trustee Kennedy, I believe that is it for the Finance Committee. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I also want to thank Mr. Brayman, Mr. Hallgren, and Ms. Malloy.
Next is 6.3, the Administration Committee. That is Trustee Dodd.
All items were listed on consent.
Municipal Services Committee, Trustee Sullivan. Sorry.
All
Dan.
items were approved on consent.
All right. Trustee Kurzman, the Public Safety Committee.
No report.
And the Judiciary Committee is Trustee Plunkett.
All items were on consent.
Item 6.7 is reports from special committees. There are no reports tonight. Item 7 is new business, and there's no new business to discuss. Item 8 is adjournment, so I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
That was Trustee Dodd. Is there a second?
Second.
That was Trustee Barrow. Would the clerk please call the roll on the motion to adjourn?
Trustee Sullivan.
Aye.
Trustee Barrow.
Aye.
Trustee Dodd.
Aye.
Trustee Kurzman.
Aye.
Trustee Kennedy.
Aye.
Trustee Plunkett.
Aye.
And President Belinsky.
Aye. So the motion carries. We stand adjourned.